The designated hour having arrived, I call to order this regular meeting of Ansel Glink's Quorum Forum podcast, the podcast local governments need to do business. In the chair, it's me, Tyler Smith. And on the agenda today, we are talking about the most controversial activities facing parks and our listeners: e-bikes and e-scooters, camping regulations, pickleball, and strategies for regulating these activities. But first, let's take the roll. First, we have an associate at Ansel Glink. He is a dedicated advocate for local governments throughout Illinois and advises public bodies on compliance with the Freedom of Information Act, zoning and land use issues, and municipal governments. Eugene Bolotnikov is here.
Present.
Next up, we have another associate at Ansel Glink. She's a rising star among Illinois Township attorneys, and she assists local governments with real estate questions, compliance with new laws, election issues, and corporate policymaking. Katie Nagy is here.
Present.
The seasons are starting to turn with some brief spells of warmer weather in Chicagoland recently, and we're all eagerly awaiting summer after a long, cold winter. In that spirit, I have a few questions about your favorite summer activities to inspire our listeners to start planning their summer vacations and other fun. Katie and Eugene, what are your first favorite summer destination activity, ideal summer day activity, and then your favorite summertime Chicago activity?
Katie, would you like to go first?
You know what, Eugene? I'll take it away. Thank you. So my favorite summer destination activity is definitely going up to northern Michigan, spending some time on the beach with my family. It's kind of a pain to get up there, but when I have the time, it's beautiful always. My ideal summer day activity is going to one of the beautiful concrete beaches in Chicago. I know Chicago gets a lot of flack sometimes for their concrete beaches, but I love them. Never have a complaint. And my favorite summertime Chicago activity is usually once or twice a summer. My friends and we will rent a boat and go out to the playpen in Chicago, and it is a very fun day when we can all get together and plan it. That's usually the hardest part, is just getting there, planning it. So usually it has something to do with the water, though. If I'm near or in Lake Michigan, I'm happy. So Eugene, please, I'm so curious what yours are.
Those are some excellent answers, and the best way I will answer my question is to bifurcate it to pre-kids and post-kids. So pre-kids, my favorite summer destination included traveling throughout Europe. I like to travel to Spain, France, Germany, Netherlands. Post-kids, favorite summer destination activity is sleeping when I get an opportunity, or relaxing on the couch. My ideal summer day activity pre-kids would be enjoying adult beverages with my friends outdoors, or playing some golf. And post-kids, my favorite activity is referring back to answer one, getting some sleep and relaxing on the couch. For my favorite summertime Chicago activity, pre-kids, I would say catching a ball game at either Wrigley Field or at what I refer to Comiskey, and I refuse to acknowledge its current name, for the Chicago White Sox. And favorite summertime activity with kids, I feels lazy to refer back to answers 1 and 2, but I will do it anyway. Additionally, I will add going to our local parks here, and actually spending time with my family is enjoyable.
Those all sound perfect, especially any activity that involves either Chicago Park along Lake Michigan, like the Lakefront Trail, or any local parks throughout the Chicagoland area and Illinois. Hopefully warmer days get here soon, so we and all of our listeners can get out there and finally enjoy some sun and remember why we like living in the Midwest. And as usual, our trusty engineer Rick is present. We have a quorum. Now, several weeks ago, Eugene, Katie, and I had the pleasure to present at the 2026 IAPD IPRA Soaring to New Heights Conference for park districts and park and recreation associations throughout Illinois. Our session, Not in My Parks, Regulating Controversial Park Activities, discussed three of the most controversial activities in parks and public spaces: e-bikes and e-scooters, public camping, and pickleball, as well as strategies for regulating these activities. We had such a great conversation with our session participants that we wanted to share it with our Quorum Forum listeners. This special episode of Quorum Forum will feature live audio from our session panel at the conference on regulating these controversial park activities. So please enjoy the following conversation, and we'll see you back after the break.
Thank you for attending Not in My Parks, Regulating Controversial Park Activities. We have a good lineup of topics we're discussing today, including laws and regulations governing the use of low-speed e-bikes and low-speed e-scooters, public camping regulations, and pickleball regulations. With respect to general authority to regulate low-speed e-bikes and e-scooters, the Park District Code, Section 1205-11, generally authorizes park districts, or empowers them with the ability to manage and control all property owned by park districts. And also sections 11-1517 and 1518 authorize broadly park districts to regulate low-speed e-bikes and low-speed e-scooters. Just a broad stroke overview of my presentation today about e-bikes. I will be discussing the legal authority that authorizes our park districts to regulate low-speed e-bikes, as well as examining some of the regulatory options available to regulate low-speed e-bikes and e-scooters. And we'll also describe some liability considerations governing the use of e-bikes and e-scooters. Broadly, there are three different classifications of low-speed electric bicycles. Class 1, as you can see the definition there, and Class 2 are pretty similar. There's just different methods of propulsion, and both are capable of reaching a maximum speed of 20 miles an hour. With respect to Class 3 low-speed e-bikes, they're a little bit different because they're capable of reaching speeds up to 28 miles an hour, and they're regulated a little bit differently, as I'll discuss throughout the presentation. Oh, also a caveat, if you have any questions, please save them, if you can, towards the conclusion of the presentation. I think it'll be a little more efficient getting through some of the topics here. So with respect to the state law default rules governing low-speed e-bikes, the Illinois Vehicle Code generally authorizes operating low-speed e-bikes upon any highway, street, or roadway that is authorized for the use by normal bicycles, including but not limited to bicycle lanes. With respect to streets and highways under its jurisdiction, a park district and another unit of local government is authorized to regulate the operation of e-bikes, including imposing some registration and licensing requirements on their use, with a few caveats that I'll also discuss a little bit later. And this is very important. However, a unit of local government, including park districts, are preempted, in other words, prohibited from enacting or enforcing e-bike regulations that are inconsistent with those in Chapter 11 of the Vehicle Code, unless the park district is expressly authorized by the Vehicle Code to impose that regulation. For example, because the Vehicle Code expressly authorizes people to operate e-bikes where normal bikes may be allowed to operate, subject to the restrictions in state law, a park district and other units of local government cannot completely ban or prohibit people from operating e-bikes where normal bikes are allowed to operate. Now delving into some of the regulatory options for low-speed e-bikes, starting from the least restrictive to the most restrictive approaches that communities can adopt. The least restrictive approach is do nothing, state law default rules. State law does not require units of local government, including park districts, to adopt any e-bike regulations. Rather, if a community so wishes, it might simply choose to enforce existing state law requirements governing e-bikes. Most municipalities and park districts and other units of local government have adopted the Vehicle Code by reference within their manuals or codes, which includes the state's regulations governing e-bikes within them. Some additional things regarding the least restrictive approach. By default, e-bikes are generally allowed to operate on any highway, street, or roadway, again, where normal bikes are allowed to operate, subject to a few restrictions established by state law. Here's one important example. All Class 3 e-bike operators must be at least 16 years old. So whereas Class 1 and Class 2 e-bikes have no age requirement imposed on them, I know, crazy. Class 3 has 16 years old, so community cannot make that age restriction 14. It cannot make it 18. Those are examples of regulations inconsistent with Chapter 11 of the Vehicle Code.
Those bikes are generally what? Motorized, bigger horsepower or what?
They're, yes, various modes of motor propulsion. And if you'd like, we can go back to the definitions at the conclusion of the presentations. Continuing the least restrictive regulatory model, the Vehicle Code's rules of the road that apply to bikes also apply to low-speed e-bikes, including this following non-exhaustive list of requirements that would be useful for park districts to know. Cyclists riding e-bikes must use a permanent and regular seat. They're prohibited from using e-bikes to carry more people than for which the bike is equipped and designed. Operators of e-bikes are prohibited from attaching the e-bike to any vehicle upon the roadway. People are prohibited from carrying any material or article like a cell phone or a package while operating an e-bike. And e-bikes must be equipped with a lamp on the front with a red reflector on the rear that's visible from certain distances, and that's a public safety requirement. Additionally, state law allows people to operate an e-bike upon any bicycle path within a village or park district, other unit of local government, where the use of e-bikes or a specific class of e-bike on that path is prohibited. State law also prohibits e-bikes on sidewalks and requires people to be 16 to operate a Class 3 e-bike, as we've discussed. However, a person younger than 16 might operate a Class 1 or Class 2 e-bike. Now going to the moderately restrictive approach. Together with enforcing state law's default requirements for e-bikes, a community may also further regulate and license e-bikes. For example, the Village of Hinsdale requires e-bike operators to complete and submit an application to receive a license and or registration tag that authorizes the applicant to operate the e-bike. Additionally, communities can impose a licensure or registration fee, a bike tag fee, and additionally, this is important to note, for all three classes of e-bikes, communities can require operators to have a driver's license, a certificate of title and registration, whereas for e-scooters, as my colleague Tyler will discuss shortly, state law actually affirmatively prohibits communities from requiring those three things. Also, with respect to some regulations and licensure things that communities can impose, they can charge applicants an application processing fee, as I discussed, licensure or registration fee. Now delving into the most restrictive approach. As we started off in the beginning of the presentation, the community cannot completely ban the operation of e-bikes where normal bikes are allowed to operate, because doing so would be inconsistent with Chapter 11 of the Vehicle Code, and here's a few of the provisions listing that prohibit doing so. However, this is an important however, unit of local government may regulate e-bikes more stringently than state law does in a few instances. For example, a unit of local government may regulate generally who can operate e-bikes, where they can be operated, and impose a few other conditions on their operation. When a community adopts e-bike regulations, if it chooses to do so, they should conspicuously post any signage along trails or entries to public property where feasible to promote notice, compliance, and enforcement with those respective regulations. So who can operate e-bikes? Class 1 and Class 2 e-bikes have no age restriction, so you can be any age to operate them under the current state law. Whereas with Class 3 e-bikes, as we've discussed, you have to be at least 16 years old. However, a community may prohibit any person from operating any class of e-bike in a park district, village, or other unit of local government unless that person is 16. That's an example of a regulation communities can adopt categorically for all three classes of e-bikes. A community may also require a parent or legal guardian to co-sign a minor's application to use an e-bike and hold the minor's parents or guardian legally responsible for their violations of the community's e-bike regulations. And with respect to where e-bikes may be operated, in accordance with state law, a community may prohibit operating e-bikes or a specific subset of e-bikes on certain bicycle paths. Additionally, e-bikes are prohibited from being used on a highway, street, or roadway where bikes normal bicycles are expressly prohibited. And a community may also restrict e-bikes from operating on streets with particularly high vehicular traffic or pedestrian traffic for public safety reasons if normal bikes are also prohibited from operating in those areas. Continuing the most restrictive approach, a community may prohibit operating e-bikes at speeds greater than reasonably prudent under the existing conditions, or from operating e-bikes on any highway with a posted speed limit of, example, 30 miles an hour or greater. Community may also prohibit people from operating e-bikes in a reckless manner that endangers or injures operators or other people, property, or animals. And a community may impose some safety requirements, and I've listed a few examples there, including requiring cyclists to walk their e-bikes in areas where riding is prohibited, requiring cyclists to ride e-bikes single file, restricting where the e-bikes can be parked to specifically designated locations where signage would be helpful in those instances. And the community may also prohibit operating e-bikes if the operator is distracted or under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Now shifting all the way to the most restrictive approach, beyond what I was talking about, prohibited e-bike regulations. As we've discussed, a community cannot categorically prohibit their use because doing so would be inconsistent with Chapter 11 of the Vehicle Code. Here are some examples of additional prohibited regulations. A community cannot completely prohibit operating Class 2 and Class 3 e-bikes because state law generally authorizes all classes of e-bikes to be operated on streets and roadways where normal bikes are allowed to operate. And the community cannot require Class 3 e-bikes to have a maximum speed of 20 miles an hour because the actual state law definition for Class 3 e-bikes is capped at 28, so you cannot reduce their maximum speed to 20, as that would be inconsistent with Chapter 11 of the Vehicle Code. And now, if you will e-scoot me, I will transition to my colleague Tyler, thank you very much, to discuss low-speed e-scooter regulations.
Thank you, Eugene. We always appreciate a clever pun at a conference presentation. Now, as we'll see shortly here over the next couple of slides, while e-scooters and e-bikes are very similar vehicles in many respects, how they're regulated under the state law default rules can be similar but also very different, and this can create some tensions and issues that we will see and explore here in the next few slides. So the vehicle code, like the e-bikes, does provide a default definition for low-speed electronic scooters, which you can see here is a device weighing less than 100 pounds with 2 or 3 wheels, and that has handlebars, a floorboard that the operator can stand upon while riding the device, and it is solely powered by an electronic motor and human power with a maximum speed with or without human propulsion that is no more than 10 miles per hour. And now if you've ever seen an e-scooter ridden out in public or ridden one yourself, you know that the vast majority of these vehicles and devices go significantly faster than 10 miles an hour. So right from the offset, this does create an issue with regulating devices and vehicles under the default rules in the state vehicle code definition, because a low-speed electronic scooter by definition is capped at a device that only goes up to 10 miles per hour, which does not cover the vast majority of these e-mobility devices out on the road. Now, in addition to providing a default definition, the state vehicle code also contains a number of default rules and regulations for low-speed electronic scooters. The most important default rule provides that the operation of low-speed electronic scooters within any municipality, park district, forest preserve district, conservation district, or any unit of local government is only allowed and authorized if that unit of local government affirmatively acts and decides to allow their use, which would usually be by the passage or adoption of an ordinance or a resolution stating that these vehicles are affirmatively allowed and adopting either the lowest, moderate, or most restrictive approach that we'll preview shortly here. Therefore, if a community does not act to affirmatively allow the use of these vehicles, they are by default prohibited in any municipality or park district. So if your park district has not already acted to allow the use of low-speed electronic scooters, anyone can be ticketed under the Illinois Vehicle Code for operating an e-scooter in a prohibited area, which enforcement standpoint, jumping a little bit ahead, that would usually be done, and a ticket could be written under the vehicle code by the municipal police department, traffic enforcement staff, if you have an intergovernmental agreement allowing them to write citations. However, if a community does, or a park district, municipality, any unit of local government decides to allow the use of low-speed electronic scooters, it would do so by the adoption of an ordinance or resolution. And once that's done, the e-scooters generally may be operated upon all highways within the jurisdiction, including sidewalks, trails, or other public rights of way where bicycles are allowed to operate. So once action is taken to allow e-scooters use, they're by default under the vehicle code then allowed anywhere where a bicycle or a cyclist is allowed to operate. And now, just like with e-bikes, e-scooters also have different regulatory options ranging from the least, moderate, to most restrictive. But unlike e-bikes, the e-scooter least restrictive approach is actually when you take action and decide to affirmatively allow the use of the vehicles. So under the least restrictive approach for low-speed e-scooters, the Park District Board would first pass an ordinance or resolution allowing their use, and then generally would just adopt all of the relevant provisions of the Illinois Vehicle Code by reference, which then incorporates and adopts all of the default operation and use requirements for low-speed electronic scooters under the Vehicle Code. And some of the most relevant ones here, which we kind of loosely classify as use regulations or just rules of the road for low-speed e-scooters, is that any low-speed e-scooter may not be operated on a road that has a posted speed limit of 35 miles per hour or greater. A person may not operate an e-scooter unless they're at least 18 years old. And then like a safety rule that we see here is that if any operator of an e-scooter generally can't operate it in an unsafe manner, which these specific rules provide that they cannot be operating it while carrying a package or other item that prevents them from having at least one hand upon the device's handlebars. Two people cannot ride an e-scooter at one time, with one person standing behind another and holding their arms around the waist or midsection. And then generally a person may not operate an e-scooter while under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Additionally, some more safety regulations that we see under the default approach here is that if operated at night, an e-scooter must be equipped with sufficient lighting on the vehicle in both the front and the rear. They must have a brake that will adequately control and stop the movement of the low-speed e-scooter. Except for e-scooters that are being used as a police or fire department vehicle, an operator or owner cannot attach a siren to such a device. And then just like with e-bikes, any person operating an e-scooter cannot attach themselves or the scooter to the back of another vehicle. It's kind of being pulled along as if they were water skiing or something like that. And as ridiculous as you think that might be, there are plenty of examples on TikTok and other social media sites of that exact behavior and its potentially disastrous consequences. And then additionally, no one can operate an e-scooter on any state highway that's under the jurisdiction of IDOT. So by default, most of those roads would already have a speed limit of greater than 35 miles per hour. So that's one reason they're not allowed that there. So then the next regulatory option is what we call the moderately restrictive approach. And in addition to allowing the use of e-scooters on Park District property and adopting the Vehicle Code default safety regulations by reference, a Park District can also adopt some additional regulations allowing for further regulation and licensure and licensing of e-scooters. So along with the default rules, what you can do is regulate and license e-scooters under the Vehicle Code is otherwise allowed by law, provided such regulations are not inconsistent with the Vehicle Code's definitions. So in addition to allowing them, generally, you can further restrict where e-scooters may be operated and limit them to certain roads, trails, sidewalks, or rights of way along Park District property. However, as a caveat, as we just talked about, you cannot prohibit e-scooters from a trail or path where bicycles are also allowed. So if bicycles are allowed on a certain path, e-scooters must be allowed on those paths as well if the park district decides to allow their use and regulate them. You can prohibit persons under 18 years of age from operating an e-scooter, which is a little different than we just saw with e-bikes for devices with a much greater top-line speed than a low-speed e-scooters, which is 16 years of age. No one under 18 under the vehicle code is allowed to operate an e-scooter, which is an example of some of the inconsistent regulations we see between these two very similar types of devices under the vehicle code. Additionally, this is a little more generally applicable to municipalities, but e-scooters can be restricted to certain zoning districts within a jurisdiction. However, an important thing from the licensing and registration standpoint is under the moderately restrictive approach, a park district can require an e-scooter operator to submit an application to receive a license and or registration tag to operate the e-scooter along park district property, and applicants can be charged a processing fee or a registration fee to help cover the administrative costs of administering and implementing that program. Additionally, you can impose reasonable speed restrictions on operating e-scooters along park district property, which is somewhat ironic given that the vehicle code's definition of a low-speed e-scooter is a device with a maximum speed of 10 miles per hour. And then additionally, just like with e-bikes, regulations can be adopted holding that a minor's parent or legal guardian is responsible for a minor's violation of the park district e-scooter regulations. And then another, short of a complete ban here, that we see some examples of how this registration and licensing requirement works. The municipality of Oak Forest authorizes people to operate e-scooters on private property only with the permission of the private property owner. And then Frankfurt is one community that authorizes people to operate e-scooters on private property as well. So once a park district decides that it wants to regulate e-scooters and allow their use, just like with e-bikes, we strongly recommend posting appropriate signage along areas where e-scooters can operate when feasible to promote compliance and enforcement. And that's the signage is a huge requirement, and it's very helpful to post signs, as we'll talk about in the next few slides here. The signage posting requirement is very important and can strongly impact when an e-scooter or e-bike operator is going to be found to be what is referred to as a permitted and intended user of park district property, which is a very important distinction for when park districts and other local government units are liable for injuries that an e-bike or e-scooter operator may suffer when operating the device on park district or municipal property. And as we briefly mentioned earlier with the least restrictive approach, it's the ironic twist for e-scooter regulations is that for the most restrictive regulations to apply, the complete ban, you actually have to do nothing at all, because the Illinois Vehicle Code's default rules for these devices is that they are prohibited and not allowed on park district property unless the park district decides to authorize their use by passage of an ordinance or other resolution. So unlike with e-scooters or e-bikes, where the most restrictive options, you had to take action and adopt ordinances and regulations, for e-scooters, the most restrictive regulations are the default rule and nothing has to be done at all. And just like with e-bikes, there are also prohibited e-scooter regulations that you cannot adopt. State law prohibits any park district from enacting or enforcing an e-scooter regulation that is inconsistent with those already adopted under the Illinois Vehicle Code. So for example, a park district cannot enact a regulation allowing persons younger than 18 to operate an e-scooter on park district property because the Vehicle Code provides that that's not allowed. You have to be at least 18. Additionally, because the Vehicle Code provides that an e-scooter operator or owner does not have to have a driver's license or a certificate of title issued by the Illinois Secretary of State's office to use and operate the vehicle, A park district regulation under the moderately restrictive approach zone cannot require that an e-scooter operator have a driver's license or that the operator of an e-scooter has a certificate of title for the device from the Secretary of State's office. And now what I'm sure everyone is mostly concerned about with e-bike and e-scooters is the liability considerations for park districts when e-scooters and e-bikes are allowed on the park district property. So when deciding whether to allow e-bikes and e-scooters on the property, a park district should be mindful of its general duty to exercise ordinary care to maintain park district property in a reasonably safe condition for someone who is an intended and a permitted user of park district property. And that standard is from the Illinois Tort Immunity Act, which provides very strong protections against negligence claims or claims for injuries that a patron might have suffered on park district property because the property is not in a reasonably safe condition. Now, a park district is only liable for injuries suffered by someone who is an intended and permitted user of park district property when that property was not maintained in a reasonably safe condition. And there is a long line of Illinois cases on when someone is a permitted and an intended user of public property in the context of bicycles and cyclists that can provide some helpful insight and guidance into when an e-bike and an e-scooter operator is going to be determined to be a user of that park district property. So there's a fairly recent Supreme Court case from 2023, called Liability versus the City of Chicago, where a cyclist was riding his bike down a City of Chicago roadway, past and on the sidewalk for this road, there was a divvy station and an e-bike station. However, the road was not listed on the City of Chicago's official bicyclist location map. There was city ordinances providing that no person is to operate a bicycle along the sidewalks of the city or on streets that are not designated as an official bicycle lane. And unfortunately, the cyclist struck a pothole in the road, fell off the bike, and sustained some injuries, and then sued the City of Chicago, arguing that the city had a duty to keep the roadways safe for cyclists, and the city failed to do so for this specific roadway. The Supreme Court ultimately determined that the city was not liable for the cyclist injuries because while the cyclist was a permitted user of that roadway, was allowed to ride the bicycle down, it was clear that he was not an intended user of that roadway under the city's affirmative actions and manifestations of intent. So because that roadway was not listed on the city's official bicycle map as a designated cycling lane, because there was no signage posted on the roadway that the city was affirmatively allowing bicycle use and it was intended and meant for bicyclist use, the city was not liable for the injuries, even though there was a divvy station and a rental station for bicycles on that roadway. And that was a fairly controversial and significant opinion because when the Illinois courts, when determining when someone is an intended user, looks at all the manifestations of the local government's intent for that property. So in the context of e-bikes and e-scooters, some strong indications that an operator is going to be an intended user of park district property is if the regulations allow e-bikes and e-scooters in the same areas where bicycles are. If there's signage posted on a trail indicating that these vehicles are allowed on that trail, they'd be found to be intended. Conversely, if you have signage postage indicating that someone is not allowed to operate an e-bike or an e-scooter on that area, and you have that encoded and codified in your regulations, that'd be strong evidence that someone is not an intended user, so then the park district would not be liable for any injuries suffered along that property. So in other words, the communities indicate, or the park district's manifestations of intent for when an e-bike and an e-scooter user is both permitted and intended will significantly impact personal injury claims against a park district for these devices. And then, as we kind of mentioned earlier, the operators of e-bikes and e-scooters are going to generally understood to be permitted users of the road unless there's an express prohibition otherwise, but they will not necessarily be found to be intended users of that property or road, unless there is other express manifestations of the park district's intent. As I mentioned, that some ways to show that express manifestation of intent is allowing the signs to be showed or painting bike lanes indicating where these vehicles and devices are meant to be used on park district property. And then as well, in addition, as Eugene and I talked about with the definitions for these vehicles, they're very narrow and speed and propulsion method specific under the vehicle code. So the vehicle code's e-bike and e-scooter regulations do not apply to other types of vehicles and devices that, while look and are operated similar to low-speed e-bikes and e-scooters, they are usually subject to separate regulations in the vehicle code and other laws. And kind of a brief and non-exhaustive types of vehicles and devices that are separately defined and regulated by the Illinois Vehicle Code are motor-driven cycles, low-speed vehicles, low-speed gas bicycles, motor vehicles, motorcycles, and mopeds. And as anyone who's seen these type of devices and low-speed e-bikes and e-scooters operate and used in the public, they look very similar, they operate very similarly, so it prevents a significant enforcement challenge to determine which section of the vehicle code to cite for someone who might be operating a low-speed vehicle or a moped instead of an e-scooter, or a low-speed e-scooter and e-bike, which the appropriate citation would be to the reference adopted by the Park District regulations or the Park District ordinances. And now I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague Katie, who's going to talk to you about Grants Pass and public camping regulations.
Thank you, Tyler. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. Today, I'll be going over public camping regulations. Quick overview, we'll be discussing the 8th Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment, the United States Supreme Court case, City of Grants Pass v. Johnson, relevant Illinois state law, local responses to public camping after the Grants Pass case, as well as Park District authority to regulate public camping on its property, and general guidance to policies and interactions with homeless populations. So before we get to the United States Supreme Court case of Grants Pass, it's important to cover the precedent that led up to that case and how we got there. So a 1962 case, Robinson versus California, the Supreme Court held that under the Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause of the 8th Amendment, California could not enforce a law providing that no person shall be addicted to the use of narcotics. The 8th Amendment provides that excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. The United States Supreme Court held that while California could not make the status of being addicted to narcotics a criminal offense, the court emphasized that the states have broad power to prohibit acts, even by those who suffer from addiction. Next, in 2018, the Ninth Circuit Court prohibited the enforcement of a public camping ordinance in Martin versus Boise. The ordinance at issue made it a misdemeanor to use streets, sidewalks, parks, or public places for camping. According to the Ninth Circuit, the 8th Amendment's Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause barred Boise from enforcing its public camping ordinance against homeless individuals who lacked access to alternative shelter. The access was lacking, according to the Ninth Circuit, whenever there were a greater number of homeless individuals in a jurisdiction than the number of available beds in shelters. So that was the standard set by the Ninth Circuit Court. If the number of unhoused individuals exceeds available beds in shelters, then that means access is lacking. Also, according to the Ninth Circuit, nearly 3/4 of Boise's shelter beds were not practically available because the charitable shelters had a religious atmosphere. So that also took out a lot of the available beds when you're comparing those numbers. Boise was thus prohibited from enforcing its camping laws. The effect of that after Martin v. Boise was local governments and park districts could not enforce their public camping regulations unless there was adequate access to alternative shelter options. I'm not personally aware of how that would be measured in effect, but I could imagine there would be difficulties enforcing the number of available beds versus the number of unhoused individuals and how those numbers would be estimated. So that really tied the hands of a lot of local government and park districts in regulating public camping. Now getting to the U.S. Supreme Court case of Grants Pass. The city of Grants Pass, Oregon, is home to roughly 38,000 people, about 600 of whom are estimated to experience homelessness on a given day. Grants Pass passed an ordinance that restricted sleeping and camping on public property, parking overnight in public parks, and other related activities. The penalties for violating this ordinance would escalate. So an initial violation of the ordinance could trigger a fine. An individual who received multiple citations could be subject to an order barring them from the city's parks for 30 days, and then violations of those orders could constitute criminal trespass that could be punishable by a maximum of 30 days in prison and a $1,200 fine. The plaintiffs filed suit against Grants Pass, claiming that the city's ordinances against public camping violated the Eighth Amendment and were unconstitutional. The plaintiffs argued that the ordinances effectively punished homeless individuals for their unhoused status. So like we saw in California in the Robinson case, where the Supreme Court held that you can't ban the status of being addicted to narcotics, the plaintiffs in Grants Pass were saying you can't punish homeless individuals for their status as an unhoused individual. The district court prohibited the city of Grants Pass from enforcing its ordinances and applied the Martin v. Boise standard to this case. The district court found that the individuals in Grants Pass were involuntarily homeless because the city's total homeless population exceeded the number of practically available shelter beds, which, as I stated, is that standard that was set by the Ninth Circuit. So the district court prohibited the city from enforcing its ordinances, and the Ninth Circuit affirmed the district court's decision. The case eventually was appealed to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court majority opinion held that the enforcement of generally applicable laws regulating camping on public property does not constitute cruel and unusual punishment that would be prohibited by the Eighth Amendment. So I'm going to be going over the majority opinion. There's a good chunk to it, but it is all relevant for our purposes. First, the court noted that limited fines and jail terms have been and remain among the usual mode for punishing criminal offenses throughout the United States. So that wasn't anything new that we were seeing in those Grants Pass ordinances. The court also disagreed with the plaintiffs that the ordinances in Grants Pass criminalized the status of being homeless. Rather, the United States Supreme Court found that public camping ordinance prohibited actions taken by any person regardless of their housing status. The court found that the camping regulations applied equally, whether the charged defendant was a person experiencing homelessness, a backpacker on vacation, or a student abandoning their dorm room to camp out in protest on the lawn of a municipality. It's important to note that the court pointed to other legal doctrines and constitutional protections that could apply, in addition to the Eighth Amendment, such as the defenses of necessity, insanity, diminished capacity, and duress. The court also noted that states and cities may add their own substantive protections for unhoused individuals. Since the case of Grants Pass versus Johnson, for example, Oregon has adopted a law specifically addressing how far its municipalities may go in regulating public camping. Next, The court found that the question of whether an individual is involuntarily homeless and whether a shelter is practically available is not found in the cruel and unusual punishments clause. So the court said, the Ninth Circuit, you created the standard, that language isn't present in the clause you're citing to. The court found that the Martin involuntary test created uncertainty for cities, and it took the power away from elected officials to answer difficult questions about unhoused individuals in their communities and the best way to regulate public camping. Therefore, in Grants Pass, the Supreme Court made a narrow ruling that the Eighth Amendment was not implicated by enforcing anti-camping ordinances against individuals that were experiencing homelessness. However, it's never that easy. Anti-camping ordinances may violate other parts of the Constitution, like excessive fines or the Due Process Clause. The court also noted that the Eighth Amendment was drafted to place limits on methods of punishment, not the determination of conduct that is criminal. Local government units are not prohibited from classifying unlawful behavior in order to address policy concerns. And again, the Supreme Court found that the Grants Pass ordinances could be applied to anyone. They didn't target unhoused individuals based on their status of being unhoused. And that ordinance, it criminalized the conduct, not the status of the individual. So as I noted, the United States Supreme Court in Grants Pass, they made a narrow ruling based on the Eighth Amendment, but they noted in the majority opinion that there's other considerations for similar local ordinances. So now I'll be discussing relevant Illinois state law. First is the Illinois Human Rights Act. First adopted in 1979, the Illinois Human Rights Act prohibits discrimination under state law for the same categories as the Federal Civil Rights Act. Additional protected classes were added over the years, including prohibition on discrimination on the basis of ancestry, physical or mental disability, access to financial credit, and the availability of public accommodations. It is a civil rights violation for a public official to deny or refuse the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, or privileges of the official's office or services, or of any property under the official's care because of unlawful discrimination. So when we discuss public accommodations, this is not an exhaustive list. The Act provides for more examples, but places of public accommodation could include an inn, hotel, a motel, places of lodging, places of public gathering, a terminal, depot, or other station used specifically for public transportation, as well as a park or other places of recreation. I skipped one act. The next one is the Illinois Bill of Rights of the Homeless Act, which was passed in 2013. This act provides specific protections for homeless populations in addition to the various state and federal constitutional protections. The act specifically prohibits discrimination based on housing status and defines what municipalities can and can't do with how they regulate homeless populations. Some of these important protections include the right to use and move freely in public spaces, such as public sidewalks, public parks, public transportation, public buildings, the right to equal treatment by all state and municipal agencies, the right to a reasonable expectation of privacy in one's personal property, which is an issue we see a lot in regulating public camping, as unhoused individuals often have property with them. Another protection is the right to vote, the right to access emergency medical care, and the right to keep one's job. In addition to these protections, it would not be surprising if the Illinois legislature were to expand protections. I'm going to discuss very quickly just House Bill 1429. It did not become effective law. The legislative session ended before there could be a vote on it, but it's just an indication of future protections we might see. House Bill 1429 amended the Bill of Rights for the homeless to prohibit the state or any unit of local government from passing ordinances that impose fines or criminal penalties against individuals for occupying or engaging in life-sustaining activities. Life-sustaining activities included moving, resting, sitting, standing, lying down, sleeping, eating, drinking. Sort of what it sounds like in the name, life-sustaining activities, things we do every day. So, to be seen whether or not a bill like this will be reintroduced, but we can probably expect more bills to this effect will happen. So after Grants Pass versus Johnson, a lot of local governments, park districts were like, okay, so we can regulate public camping. What do we do with that? A lot of local governments actually had ordinances already in place to impose civil penalties for camping activity. But after Grants Pass, some of the newer ordinances we saw rising were the escalating fines, similar to what I said previously. And under those escalating penalties, there was a chance for up to 6 months of incarceration. Issue with the local response to that effect is singling out homeless individuals for criminal penalties could expose units of local government to claims under the Illinois Human Rights Act, Illinois Civil Rights Act, and again, the Illinois Bill of Rights for the Homeless Act. So there does need to be care taken in regulating public camping. Grants Pass was not no pun intended, was not a free pass to just regulate however you want. There are still Illinois state law protections in place that units of local government and park districts have to be aware of and comply with. Illinois courts have upheld efforts to regulate public property. For example, in Chicago v. Alexander, several protesters were arrested after they stayed in Chicago's Grant Park after hours during the Occupy Chicago protests. The protesters' charges were initially dismissed by the trial court, which determined that the charging ordinance was unconstitutional. On appeal, the appellate court acknowledged that the protesters were exercising their First Amendment rights of free expression and speech, but on the other hand, the city had the right to enact regulations, such as hours of operation, on the use of its parks. The court held that the park's hours of operation was a content-neutral regulation, which means regardless of the speech, the message, topic, or viewpoint, it focused on the aspect of time, place, or manner. It didn't matter why those individuals were in the park, what they were saying. It just mattered, these are our hours of operation, and you're violating those hours. The court also found that the hours of operations applied to all city parks and that there was a legitimate reason for the regulation, which was to preserve the park's cleanliness and safety. So now turning to the Park District's regulatory authority. I know this was touched on previously, but under the Park District Code, park districts may pass ordinances for managing and conducting park district business and managing and controlling all property of the district. Park districts do have regulatory powers to permit them to address how homeless individuals can interact with their parks. However, as I keep repeating myself because it is important, you need to be careful in how you pass those ordinances. There are many anti-discrimination laws that could be raised by those ordinances, and you also need to apply enforcement of those ordinances equally. So someone's in the, let me rephrase, I'm not going to go after kids right now in the park. Let's say there's a homeless individual, again, in the park, past hours of operation. If you're going to enforce the regulations on that individual, you have to enforce it to everyone equally. You can't single out that homeless individual. It needs to be applied equally. So generally applicable laws that may address homelessness in public parks include, again, hours of operation, curfew, permit requirements for camping, criminal trespass, and disorderly conduct. And again, enforcing these regulations should be done in a non-discriminatory manner. Trespassers in park districts may also be arrested. Generally, they receive citations, but there is language in the Illinois Criminal Code to provide for a custodial arrest. You can see the 3 situations up there when a custodial arrest can occur. When the accused poses a threat to the community or any person, because the criminal activity persists after the issuance of a citation, or the accused has an obvious medical or mental health issue that poses a risk to the accused's own safety. So sometimes a citation may be issued, but custodial arrests may also take place. And then I just want to end on general guidance for interacting with homeless individuals. The Illinois Law Enforcement Response to Homelessness Guidebook is a great resource. It recognizes that homeless populations and regulating them as well as interacting with them, it's a multifaceted issue. The handbook encourages development of policies and encourages training for different scenarios. So thank you guys for your time, and I will pass it on over to Tyler.
Thank you, Katie. And then we're going to wrap this up today by just quickly going over pickleball and how changes and new modes of zoning regulations can affect the location of new pickleball facilities for park districts. So just quick show of hands, whose park district in the audience has outdoor pickleball facilities? Everyone in the audience. How many of you have had to go through controversial public hearings for those new outdoor pickleball courts? Almost one or a few people. Very shocking. And then finally, how many of you live near an outdoor pickleball court? Very few as well. And as we'll get into shortly here, the biggest complaints that we commonly see from residents and patrons about outdoor pickleball courts is organized and sustained by people who live near the parks where outdoor pickleball facilities are located. So, as we talked about this a few years ago, and I'm sure everyone knows, pickleball is one of the most rapidly growing and popular outdoor recreational activities in America, and public interest has continued to grow and accelerate since COVID. In 2024, U.S. Pickleball, which is a governing association for professional and amateur pickleball players in America, sanctioned over 140 tournaments, and pickleball doubles and single tournaments are increasingly being broadcast on ESPN and other major television networks. And then the Pickleheads database, which is a public database location of outdoor pickleball courts, now includes over 68,000 pickleball court locations with over 18,000 courts added in 2024. And pickleball is this demand is spurring huge investment and growth by park districts, private companies, and other ones. Is a huge revenue generating activity. The state of Illinois in the most recent budget approved over $2.6 million in grants to local governments and nonprofits to develop and run tennis, pickleball, and outdoor racquetball courts. South Lake City in Utah will have over 40 pickleball courts operating this year. And other municipalities are investing multi-million dollars in pickleball projects. So in order to capture this revenue and growth, locating avenues and places for new pickleball facilities is a huge concern. And it is especially hard to find new outdoor locations for these facilities that aren't already being used for pickleball and that won't generate significant and sustained resident pushback. In contrast to some park projects that have broad support and favorable viewpoints among communities, outdoor pickleball courts can generate significant, sustained, and strong resident pushback. And the most common complaint we see from this is always about the noise factor. And anyone who's played pickleball can picture the sound, that sharp pop. But there are some very specific characteristics of pickleball noise that lead to these noise complaints that tennis and other racket sports don't, or even basketball doesn't. From the physical factor and characteristic, pickleball, unlike tennis, is a very hard plastic ball, and the rackets are solid facing and not tension-based strings. So that produces a sound at a frequency of around 1,250 hertz, which is a frequency that makes it very susceptible to traveling far across pavement, and it reduces the sound mitigation effects of trees and other sound barriers. And additional, the social factors is for outdoor pickleball courts, and especially in summer months, they charge, when there's not a time reservation system in place, it can draw large crowds of people who, while are waiting for a court to open, are mingling about and socializing. So in addition to the constant pop, pop, pop for a pickleball game, you also get increased ambient noise background from people just enjoying parks and facilities, which always is a good thing, but it can lead to periods, especially in the summer months, of 12 to 15 hours where residents who live near these outdoor facilities have both the pickleball sounds and then elevated levels of background noise. So in addition to the noise complaints, there also have been some very innovative use of lawsuits to challenge outdoor pickleball facilities. Some have been under the Endangered Species Act, some have been nuisance complaints. It can really incur some very innovative litigation, which can be expensive, which means building a community consensus for new pickleball outdoor court projects can be very useful in preventing expensive and time-consuming litigation. And one of the new emerging trends in regulating pickleball is the use of municipal and local land use zoning controls. And park districts and municipalities can have very conflicting roles and viewpoints in the zoning process. A park district's use or goal and role in the land use development process is to create parks and facilities that people and patrons enjoy. While a municipality, such as the local zoning board, the planning and zoning commission, or a city or village board, might have more concerns about political issues, with residents being upset about the noise and potentially launching campaigns or negative ads during election seasons. And one example of a new zoning approach that we're seeing is from the APA, the American Planning Association, is a noise-sensitive land use zoning model, which works by defining noise-sensitive land uses, which commonly are things like residential homes, senior living facilities, schools or hospitals, where quiet and rest is important to that land use. And this approach works by once defining and identifying those noise-sensitive land uses, creating distance-based zones, and which are commonly referred to as a prohibited zone, a conditional use zone, or a by right zone. So for the prohibited zone is commonly, and we're seeing it based on distances that range in the hundreds of feet distance. So 500 feet, 250 feet, 700 feet, where pickleball is outright prohibited if it's within that area. So misspoke. The prohibited zone is the setback distance in which outdoor courts are banned. So that's closer you are to one of those noise-sensitive land uses, an outdoor pickleball court will not be permitted by the municipality. And then moving backwards and out, you have the conditional use zone, where a pickleball court is going to be allowed subject to a conditional use permit and municipal zoning approval. And then the by right zone, which is the furthest distance from those noise-sensitive land uses, would be the 500 to 750 feet zone, where a pickleball court is allowed by right. You would not need any municipal zoning approval. So as we can see from that is a more emerging trend, and it's not one that's been widely adopted yet, but this might be one area where land use and zoning regulations are going if resident concern continues to press strongly upon local elected officials. So if you're still looking to expand your outdoor pickleball courts, what can you do? And the general recommendations we have is to identify locations, facilities that are away from residential areas, limit the number of courts at outdoor facilities, as well as adopting time of use regulations, hours of play regulations. Residents generally greatly appreciate having no play after 6 p.m. or even one day a week where it's not allowed. Maybe it's a Sunday or a Monday, and that does present a point of tension with park districts because Saturdays and Sundays are prime days for patrons to come play and enjoy pickleball courts. Engaging residents in a collaborative process prior to announcing the project can be one way to mitigate pushback, and as well as installing landscaping and sound barriers, which can be cost prohibitive and generally don't have the same effect on pickleball as it does for other outdoor recreation facilities. So if you're thinking of installing pickleball courts, it's important to carefully review your local municipal regulations, as new zoning regulations or current zoning regulations might limit where they can be located. And if you do have to go to a public hearing, don't expect it might be as simplistic as some other projects. Pickleball hearings can be very contentious, and we frequently are seeing some of these requiring multi-$1,000 sound studies by consultants.
We're glad to have our listeners back with us, and we hope you all enjoyed learning about strategies and options for regulating e-bikes and e-scooters, public camping, and pickleball. However, as with any well-conducted, lawful meeting, we need to have public comment. This week, we received a question regarding whether a public body may refuse to disclose a public employee's termination letter in response to a records request under the Freedom of Information Act. Now, Eugene, as our go-to FOIA expert, what are your thoughts on this question?
Thank you, Tyler. Generally, the answer to the question is no. Termination letters explaining why a public employee was discharged are considered public records that are presumably subject to disclosure under the Illinois Freedom of Information Act. This was recently reiterated in PAC Binding Opinion 2516, which was the last binding opinion of the 2025 year, wherein the Illinois Attorney General's Public Access Counselor held that a village could not withhold a termination letter entirely based on privacy concerns or based on the Personal Records Review Act. The PAC specifically reasoned that the letter concerned the employee's conduct while in public employment, which is a matter of legitimate public interest because it bears on their ability to perform public duties, and therefore the termination letter was not part of a formal adjudicative proceeding and was not exempt under Section 71N of FOIA either.
Thank you for that, Eugene. Us and our listeners always appreciate getting a touch-up on FOIA from one of the preeminent experts on that act. And now the next item on our meeting agenda is the Department of Public Works. Katie, do we have any publications, speeches, or conferences coming up that our listeners should be looking out for?
We have a busy summer, you guys. We should have amended our answers, Eugene, to include our favorite summer activity is presenting to communities throughout Illinois, if only we could go back. So there's several exciting conferences to look forward to, as well as publications. First up, Ansel Glink equity partner David Silverman will be a speaker at the 2026 National Planning Conference in Detroit on Sunday, April 26, 2026. David will be presenting The Legacy of Euclid, 100 Years On. The session will provide a deep dive into the 1926 Supreme Court decision, Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company, which established the constitutional basis for municipal zoning. David will explore how its legacy continues to shape contemporary challenges in development and housing policy. If you're heading to Detroit for the conference, save the date for this important session. David Silverman will also be busy this summer. He will also be presenting with Ansel Glink partner Greg Jones at the APA Illinois State Section Conference in mid-April to talk about the BUILD plan and other recent legislation which proposes state preemption over local zoning authority. Our one and only associate Eugene Bolotnikov will be presenting at the Municipal Clerks of Illinois Spring Seminar in Elgin, Illinois on April 23rd, 2026. Eugene will be giving tips on the Freedom of Information Act and how to respond to repeat requesters. Eugene, anything you'd like to add about that session?
No, you thoroughly and accurately summarized what I will be discussing, and I hope that our listeners of the Quorum Forum podcast will attend.
Great, thank you. And then last but definitely not least, multiple Ansel Glink attorneys, including yours truly, will be presenting at the Illinois Township Attorneys Association Seminar on May 15th, 2026 at the Hanover Township Senior Center. Sessions at the seminar will include tips on navigating First Amendment audits, best practices for townships and board meetings, and navigating changes to SNAP and general assistance. So we hope, dear listeners, to see you at some of these upcoming presentations.
Thanks for that update, Katie. That is a lot of exciting things going on this summer for our attorneys and our listeners. And that is everything on our meeting agenda for today. And a big thank you to Eugene and Katie for joining us. Any final thoughts before we adjourn?
I hope everyone has a great summer and gets to enjoy some of the sunshine that will hopefully be here soon.
I could not have said it better myself. I echo those sentiments.
And on that note, before we go, we want to remind everyone to subscribe and please leave us a review wherever podcasts are heard. As always, we prefer good reviews. You can email us your questions and any show ideas at podcast@anselglink.com and visit us online at quorumforum.anselglink.com. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? And the
Aye.
ayes have it. See you next time on Ansel Glink's Quorum Forum podcast.